There's a psychological experiment that's been running for 40 years. Nobody designed it. Nobody consented to it. And the results are absolutely catastrophic. Millions of people are living inside this experiment right now. It started with good intentions. Parents trying to do better. A society believing they were creating the most successful generation in history. Instead, they created a generation that scores higher on narcissism than anyone before them. And also higher on depression and anxiety. At the same time, I'm talking about millennials. We have an entire demographic walking around with a bizarre psychological cocktail in their brains. They believe they are destined for greatness, yet feel like complete failures. They are confident and terrified at the exact same time. It's basically a trauma response with a LinkedIn profile. How is this possible? To understand it, you have to look at the timeline. Because millennials were the test subjects for every parenting trend that came out of the self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s. Helicopter parents, participation trophies, the idea that you are smart just for existing, the belief that criticism damages children and that everyone is a winner. Parents genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. The research from that era suggested that high self-esteem leads to achievement. So they shielded their kids from failure. They protected them from disappointment. And millennials absorbed this. They grew up with a deep, unshakable belief that they were special, that the world owed them success, that if they just believed in themselves, everything would work out. But here is where the experiment went sideways. Those millennials hit their 20s right as the economy completely imploded in 2008. They graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed. They were promised that effort equals outcome. But reality showed them something completely different. The psychological term for this is schema disruption, when your fundamental map of the world turns out to be wrong, when the contract is broken. The whiplash alone should have hospitalized people. Think about the actual timeline here for a second. Millennials were the test subjects for every parenting trend that came out of the self-esteem movement. Helicopter parents. Everyone gets a trophy. You're smart just for existing. Participation awards for showing up. Constant praise. Endless validation. The idea that criticism damages children. That struggle is bad. That everyone is a winner. These weren't bad intentions. Not at all. These were earnest attempts at better parenting based on the psychology available at the time. Parents genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. That boosting their kids' self-esteem would create confident, successful adults. The research from that era suggested that high self-esteem leads to achievement. That if children believe in themselves, they'll accomplish more. It made perfect sense. So an entire generation of parents took that research and ran with it. They shielded their kids from failure, protected them from disappointment, made sure they never felt bad about themselves, told them they were special, unique, destined for greatness, and millennials absorbed all of this. They internalized the message. They genuinely believed it. Because why wouldn't they? It's what every trusted adult in their life was telling them. So they grew up with this deep, unshakable belief that they were meant for something significant. That the world owed them success. That if they just worked hard and believed in themselves, everything would work out. But here's what nobody anticipated. Here's where the experiment went completely sideways. Those millennials hit their 20s right as the economy completely imploded in 2008. They graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed. Into an economic reality that was nothing like what they'd been prepared for. The whiplash alone should have hospitalized people. You're 22 years old. You just graduated college. You did everything right. Good grades, extracurriculars, internships, leadership positions. Everything your parents and teachers told you to do. You have a degree, a good one, from a decent school. You followed the path. You checked all the boxes. And then you look for a job. And there's nothing. The market has collapsed. Companies are laying off experienced workers by the thousands. Nobody's hiring. And the few positions that exist, they want 5 years of experience for entry-level roles. You have debt. Lots of it. More than your parents paid for their entire house. And it's growing every month because interest doesn't care about recessions. This is what happened to millions of millennials, all at once, right when they were supposed to launch into adult life. But it gets worse. Because the job market didn't just temporarily contract, it fundamentally changed. The whole structure of employment shifted. Pensions disappeared. Full-time positions became contract work. Benefits became optional. Job security became a joke. The idea of working for one company for 30 years and retiring with a gold watch, gone. And the economy that replaced it? It was built on instability, on temporary positions, on gig work, on being an independent contractor with no benefits, no stability, no safety net. Millennials didn't choose this. They walked into it, after being told their whole lives that hard work and education would guarantee success. The psychological term for when reality fundamentally violates your core beliefs about how the world works is schema disruption. And when it happens on a generational scale, you don't just get disappointed people. You get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to everything. To institutions, to authority, to the concept of meritocracy, to the idea that fairness exists. This explains why millennials are characterized as both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. They still believe things should be fair. They just no longer believe they will be. That's not entitlement. That's not laziness. That's pattern recognition based on lived experience. But the economic crisis was only half the story, because while all of this was happening, something else appeared. Social media hit millennials right in their formative years, not as children like Gen Z, but as teenagers and young adults. Right when their identities were still forming. Right when they were trying to figure out who they were. Facebook launched in 2004, Instagram in 2010, Twitter, Snapchat. All of it arrived right as millennials were becoming adults. And here's what makes this psychologically devastating. Millennials had to learn how to be adults while simultaneously learning how to perform their lives for an audience. Think about that for a second. Every previous generation got to figure out adulthood in relative privacy. They could fail without documentation. They could struggle without broadcasting it. They could be messy and uncertain and confused without the entire world watching. Millennials didn't get that luxury. They had to curate their lives, edit their experiences, perform success even when they were barely surviving. Dr. Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being shows something crucial here. When people base their self-worth on external validation, their mental health tanks, you're essentially running a 24/7 campaign for your own existence. And the polls never close. You wake up and check how your life performed overnight. You post something and wait to see if people approve. You scroll and compare your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. It's exhausting, and it never stops. But here's the real psychological damage. Social media doesn't just make you perform. It makes you believe that performance is reality. That the curated version is the real version. That if you're not posting about it, it didn't happen. That if people aren't liking it, it doesn't matter. So millennials learn to optimize for engagement, to shape their lives around what plays well online, to measure their worth in likes and comments and shares. And all of this was happening while they were trying to build actual lives, while they were struggling with debt and terrible job markets and broken promises. The performance never matched reality, but they had to keep performing anyway. Because stopping felt like giving up, like admitting failure, like proving they weren't special after all. And while they were building these perfect digital lives, their real lives kept slipping further and further away. There are traditional markers of adulthood that used to give people a sense of having arrived. Marriage, home ownership, having children, financial stability. For previous generations, these milestones happened in their 20s. By 30, most people had checked most of these boxes. Millennials want these things. Surveys show they absolutely want them. They're not rejecting traditional life paths. They're not choosing to delay adulthood. The economic reality just makes it borderline impossible. Home ownership. The median home price has increased by over 300% since the 80s. Wages haven't come close to keeping pace. What used to take a few years of savings now takes a decade or more, if it happens at all. And that's assuming you can save, which is hard when you're paying off student loans that previous generations didn't have, when you're working gig economy jobs without benefits, when you're paying rent that eats half your income. Marriage and children. Those require stability, financial security, a foundation, things that feel impossible when you can't afford basic housing. So millennials wait, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. And here's what's psychologically devastating about prolonged waiting. Your brain doesn't just pause. It doesn't go into hibernation. Instead, it creates this constant low-level stress that researchers call allostatic load. It's your body's stress response preparing for something that never actually comes. You're stuck in the loading screen of your own life, watching that progress bar, waiting for it to move. And it just doesn't. Years pass. You get older, and you're still waiting for your real life to start. You're 35 years old, 40, still in a studio apartment that costs $2,200 a month, still working contract positions, still paying off student debt, still waiting. And your therapist is booked until March, if you can even afford one. The impact of this kind of prolonged uncertainty is surprisingly well documented. When achieving what society defines as adulthood becomes unattainable, your brain doesn't shrug and move on. It stays stressed, constantly, because you're always almost there, always on the verge, always waiting for the next thing that might finally launch you into actual adult life. But that launch never comes, and the waiting continues, and the stress builds, and builds, and builds. And the worst part? Society looks at millennials stuck in this permanent waiting room and asks why they're so anxious, why they can't just grow up, why they won't just buy a house, as if the waiting is a choice. But it was a simple equation, a clear path. Study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up, buy a house, start a family, retire comfortably. Effort equals outcome. Merit gets rewarded. That contract had worked for a long time. For the silent generation. For baby boomers. For Gen X. It wasn't perfect, but it generally held true. Except the landscape had shifted in ways nobody anticipated. The contract had been rewritten. But nobody told them. College. And those entry-level jobs they were promised. Now they require 5 years of experience and a master's degree. The gig. And millennials showed up ready to follow the path they'd been shown, only to find that the path had disappeared. The cycle. And when it happens on a generational scale, you don't just get disappointed people. You get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to everything. This explains why millennials are characterized as both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. That's not entitlement. That's not laziness. That's pattern recognition based on lived experience. And then older generations call them disloyal, entitled, unwilling to pay their dues. You know what's fascinating about that criticism? Corporate America fundamentally changed the employment relationship first. Pensions disappeared in the 80s and 90s. The idea of a company taking care of you for life? Gone. Mass layoffs became normalized business strategy. Loyalty from employer to employee evaporated. So when millennials treat jobs as transactional, when they jump ship for better pay, they're not inventing disloyalty. They're adapting. Why would you be loyal to a company that could fire you tomorrow to improve shareholder value? That's not a character flaw. That's a completely rational response to the actual conditions of modern employment. Millennials learned the rules, not the rules they were taught, the real rules. But there's something else about millennials that often gets overlooked, something that makes them different in ways that matter. Millennials are one of the most educated generations in history. They're also the most diverse generation. And they grew up with the internet, not as something that arrived when they were adults, but as something that developed alongside them. This creates a very specific psychological profile. Millennials question everything, not out of disrespect, but because they've seen multiple versions of truth depending on who's telling the story. They've watched the news contradict itself. They've seen corporations lie. They've watched institutions fail. They've seen behind the curtain, and they can't unsee it. So they interrogate, they push back. People who interrogate systems that were never designed to be questioned get labeled as difficult, as entitled. But critical thinking meeting structures built on unexamined assumptions will always look like that. It looks like rebellion when really it's just examination. And here's what's remarkable. Millennials are also the first generation to widely destigmatize mental health. They talk about therapy like it's normal, like asking for help is strength instead of weakness. Except they're doing this while living in conditions that are objectively more stressful than previous generations faced. So you get this weird dynamic. Millennials are simultaneously more self-aware and more overwhelmed. They're running the race while describing exactly why the race is rigged. But there's one more layer to this. Millennials are also the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate while being told that they need to fix it. Climate change isn't theoretical for them. It's happening right now, visibly, measurably. And the message they get is clear. This is your problem to solve. You need to fix this. Except they have comparatively less institutional power and resources to actually do anything at the scale required. There are people with student debt working gig economy jobs trying to afford rent, and they're supposed to stop global environmental collapse somehow. It's existential dread with a side of helplessness. Climate anxiety is a legitimate psychological phenomenon now. So what you've got is a generation shaped by impossibly high expectations, economic instability, constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front-row seat to multiple overlapping crises. The psychology of millennials isn't mysterious. It isn't complicated. It becomes incredibly predictable when you actually look at what they've been through. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the landscape shifts beneath them, and the map they were given no longer matches the territory. They're not broken. They're not entitled. They're adapting. They're surviving. And honestly, the fact that they're still trying, still pushing forward, still believing things could be better, that's not weakness. That's resilience. That's strength. That's an entire generation refusing to give up. If this resonated with you, if any of this felt familiar or helped you understand something you've been feeling, subscribe. Because understanding what's actually happening in our heads, understanding the psychology behind the patterns we can't seem to break, that matters. And we're going to keep digging into it.